Hello, and thank you for checking out the inaugural episode of Savage Ecology. This will be a channel dedicated to education on all things ecology, and first we are going to explore invasive species. This will be a two-part series. First, exploring a high-level overview of what invasive species are and the threats that they can impose. In our second video, we will look into how you yourself can help. This will more specifically pertain to my local area of Northeast Florida. However, the majority of the information will be relevant just about anywhere in the world. All right, let's get started. So you may be wondering what an invasive species is. These are any organism, plant, animal, or microorganism that is not native to their ecosystem and pose a threat to causing environmental or economic harm. The second part of this is key to defining an invasive versus a non-native species. Not all species that aren't native to the area they establish are invasive by nature. For example, many fruit and vegetable crops are not native to North America, but we grow them just fine here without concern. Think of an invasive species as one that spreads and expands their population unchecked and has adverse effects on other species or a whole ecosystem. These are not always, but usually a result of human activity, although this is typically unintentional. There are many ways invasive species can be introduced. Some primary examples of how they can start being established include being stowaways on shipping containers, ornamental plants escaping into the wild, and unwanted exotic pets being released. Just about anywhere you go in the world will have at least some problems with invasive species, but the specific species will vary greatly depending on where you go. Let's look through some examples of some of the most problematic ones in my backyard of Northeast Florida. These may or may not pertain to where you live as well, but will certainly give you an idea of some of the problems invasive species can create. The Cuban tree frog first came to the Florida Keys in the 1920s by stowing away on shipping containers. It is now widespread throughout the majority of the state. This is now the largest North American tree frog, growing up to 5 inches in length. They prey on at least 5 native tree frogs as well as other small reptiles. They can be very difficult to identify with their colors ranging from green, gray, brown, and white, and have varying markings on their body. They are very common in urban areas and can create utility damage through power outages and sewage backup. Native to the Indo-Pacific, the lionfish was first found in Florida in 1985 and has already spread across the entire peninsula as well as much of the rest of the Atlantic coast and throughout the Gulf of Mexico. They are predatory reef fish that preys on over 70 marine fish, being able to consume prey over half their size. Their populations can reach 200 adults per acre and regularly outcompete native predator fish such as grouper and snapper. One way that has been recommended to combat the growing numbers is through fishing, as they are edible and are starting to become more common in grocery stores and restaurants. The Chinese tallow or popcorn tree has an interesting history of its introduction to the U.S., as it was first brought here by Benjamin Franklin in the 1700s as a use for candle wax. It was further established in the early 1900s as an ornamental plant with a potential for seed oil production. It was initially recommended by the USDA and has since invaded much of the southeastern states and is now listed as a noxious weed and is prohibited from further planting. I find this to be an interesting example of how most invasive species can be blamed on human activity, although not from malicious or negligent intent, but just simply ignorance before knowing better. The Brazilian pepper tree, also known locally as Christmas berry or Florida holly, was initially brought here in the 1840s as an ornamental plant. This is one of the worst examples of an ornamental plant going wild, as it is an extremely aggressive plant and can take over entire spots in many different areas, from roadside ditches to coastal dunes. This one species has already overtaken more than 700,000 acres of land in Florida alone. Our last example is a recent threat to Florida's waterways. The giant salvinia is a free-floating aquatic fern that creates mats that cover a water body. This blankets the surface and shades and crowds out native plants, as well as reducing oxygen and water quality for fish and other marine life. This plant has already caused extensive ecological and economic damage for Louisiana and Texas, and has been put on the Early Detection Rapid Response Program by our Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. If you see this anywhere, it's been stressed to report immediately through the FWC website or hotlines. Hopefully what we've gone through so far has given you an idea of what invasive species are and the varying ways they can have adverse effects. To close out this first video, let's go through a review of the ways they are creating environmental and economic harm to our communities. One of the worst effects invasive species have on local ecosystems is biodiversity loss, which in turn threatens the stability and overall functionality of the ecosystem. This has led to much further environmental harm, such as water and air quality, loss of protection against storms, and a reduction in resources, among many other ecosystem service losses. Furthermore, this can also lead to the total extinction of native species. The introduction of non-native species has doubled over the past 50 years. This has cost the North American economy an estimated $1.26 trillion. Here in Florida directly, the cost of managing just invasive plant species are more than $45 million annually. Thank you very much for checking out the first video of Savage Ecology. To extend your knowledge on invasive species and find out what you can do to help, check out the next video in the series. Thanks again, and think ecologically.